Disclaimer: everything that I disclose in this video is in the public domain and is accessible freely via the internet and several publications, which are available both for free and via purchase. Nothing that is not within the public domain will be shared in this video. There's a fine line between a professional criminal and a businessman. A grey area between these two occupations exists, and in this overlap, it is here where the lines between the legal and the illegal are the most difficult to distinguish between. If there are two faces who could fit this criteria more than anyone else, it could possibly be the Blundell brothers. These two brothers have attracted some serious interest on my channel. The re-uploaded interview with the Blundells and Bernard O'Mahony is the most viewed video on the channel to date. Charismatic, well-dressed and confident, Eddie Blundell and his younger brother Billy were striking, memorable characters who you would not forget in a hurry, especially if you got on the wrong side of them. Bernard O'Mahony, also known as Bernard O'Baloney to many due to his status of being a legend in his own mind, and generally someone who likes to think he is more important than he actually is, said the Blundells were deemed to be more dangerous than the Krays, and the most powerful figures in the region. Well, I doubt two 70-odd-year-old men are the most powerful, dangerous people in Essex, so perhaps a comment was merely a statement of times gone by. But again, we come back to the crux of the question we face. If the Blundells were so dangerous and powerful, how did they acquire this reputation through selling ice cream and ferrying people around Ilford in their minicabs? You're watching London Uncovered, and this is Who Really Were the Blundells? Billy and Eddie Blundell were born in 1942 and 1940 respectively in Kensington, West London. They were born to a Spanish mother and an English father. Eddie wrote a book, Top Drawer Villain, in which he notes his mother has ties to the Andalusian royalty. When I first saw the Blundells, I thought something was a bit odd. I thought they didn't look particularly English, and sure enough I was right. I read Eddie's book, and his mother was Spanish, closely, well, perhaps not closely, but somehow related to Andalusian royalty, and his dad was a police officer, ironically, in Gibraltar. And they were born in Kensington. They would grow up and they would speak Spanish, and then they would have conversations with their mum in Spanish, and the Blundells would reply in English. They were then evacuated out in the war out to Northern Ireland, and after Northern Ireland they were then sent back to London to Marylebone, and then by Eddie's 14th birthday they had relocated out to here in South Ockenden, where I am right now. South Ockenden was a new estate built for the London overspill that were bombed out of the city. The Blundell family were some of the first pioneers for the new settlement, which at the time had no shops or any amenities. Many East End families were being moved out to the estate as they worked in the nearby Ford factory at Dagenham. It must have been a very desolate place at this time. I'm standing here in South Ockenden now. I'd like to say it's come a long way since when the Blundells were around and first moved here, but in all honesty, not a lot's changed. We've got a few parades of shops now and a supermarket and a leisure centre. Other than that, it's certainly not going to be the next trendy area to appear in London or anything like that. Eddie Blundell tried his hand at several jobs, but failed to hold them down. He found that none of them interested him. Perhaps he had what we would now identify as ADHD, which is present in 1 in 4 British prisoners. The Blundells would associate themselves at the Ilford Palais nightclub, which at the time was run by none other than Jimmy Savile. However, Eddie's taste for the bright lights of Ilford soon came to an end when he and several of his friends were sent to Borstal after spontaneously deciding to rob a co-op warehouse in Grays. It was here in which their descent into villainy began. After several spells in Borstals, one of which he escaped from, by 1961 Eddie Blundell was driving lorries. In 1963 he decided to go into the ice cream business, having worked for the Bastianis. Eddie would buy up cheap ice cream vans across Essex and moved into parking them outside tourist sites in the West End. The two brothers soon came to the attention of the Cray twins, who asked them to join their firm, but the Blundells were not interested. Their ice cream business was becoming ever more profitable, and associating with the Crays would not. However, they were facing competition from the Turks, who ran their own food and drink stalls outside tourist hotspots. In the winter months, as you can imagine, ice cream isn't exactly popular, so the Blundells began to run a 24-hour minicab business out of 7th Avenue in Manor Park. At the time, Eddie Blundell was living in Forest Gate. They also had financial interests at the famous Room at the Top nightclub in Ilford. The Blundells soon came to the attention of the London News, who were told about the way they would intimidate other vendors. They decided to see what would happen themselves, setting a journalist to pose as a rival vendor.
We only had to wait about 20 minutes before something happened.
What's your game, pal?
Pardon?
What's your fucking game?
What game?
You know this is Eddie's pitch.
Oh.
Right, if you're fucking working here tomorrow...
All right, I'll go.
However, when repeated, without informing Blundells' associate, Joe Cannon, of their plans, the incident did not occur again. The police believe the threats were an ingenious scheme to suggest the allegations made against Blundell, which he would be answering to in court, were bogus, and that the incident would cast doubt on the credibility of these allegations. Top Drawer Villain provides a lot more context to the events that preceded the shootout on Ilford High Road one day in 1971, which is the subject of the Bernard O'Mahony video. It appears that cousin Pepe, aka Pepe Larios, was assaulted by Larry Thompson, a friend of Tommy Enever, one of Blundell's neighbours who irritated him by coming back from the pub in the afternoon, heavily intoxicated. Pepe was having a liaison with Thompson's wife, but the two weren't together, so Thompson gave Pepe his blessing. However, one day when Thompson was drunk, he gave Pepe a slap. The Blundell brothers were furious at this hostility shown towards their cousin. Eddie attempted to reason with Thompson, but the argument turned hostile. One night, Pepe was coming back from his car when he found himself being chased by a gunman. Pepe managed to get into a property the Blundells owned, 41 7th Avenue in Manor Park, and a gunman fired through the door. The police were called, and Pepe was asked to give a statement, but he did not. However, Enever believed he had, and went round to the Blundells to ask them. Billy tried to assault Enever, but a poorly aimed punch smashed their front window instead of Enever's face. Not long after this, the Blundells were drinking with some of their associates in the volunteer pub, Barking. It was demolished around the turn of the century to make way for the widening of the A13, and no trace of it remains. On the day in question, Enever and his friends clashed with Blundells and their associates. Words were exchanged. Enever called Eddie a profanity. Billy Blundell, Eddie's younger brother, smashed his glass against the bar and then stabbed Enever several times with the broken glass. After this unfortunate encounter, in which both sides ended up in the local hospital, feared bare-knuckle boxer Donnie the Bull Adams got involved. He was a friend of Enever's and began to threaten the Blundells. Knowing a showdown was imminent, the Blundells armed themselves and retreated to their cab office on Ilford High Road. It was 10 p.m. on a cold, late December night just before the end of the year. Billy had a shotgun in his car and parked on a side street adjacent to the cab office. Enever, Donnie Adams and other associates, armed with an automatic pistol, took shots at the Blundells in the street. As in the interview, we all know what happened then. Eddie got shot and got taken to King George Hospital, though it's unclear if he actually lost 8 pints of blood, given this is close to all the blood stored in the human body. What we do know is that when it got to court, Billy Blundell was cleared of attempted murder on the grounds of self-defence. From here, the Blundells continued their business interests, which often stepped into organised criminality, such as running security operations at music festivals. Their activities were enabled by systemic corruption in the Metropolitan Police at the time. By 1976, however, Operation Countryman had rooted out a large number of these corrupt officers. It was then that the Blundells' fortunes perhaps began to expire. One rumour is the reason why they ended up living out in South Ockenden was that they were chased out of London by their rivals. Ironically, the two brothers were mentioned in Judas Pig, effectively an autobiography of Jimmy Holmes, David Hunt's former associate. Described as Long Lemmy and Little Titch, Eddie is described as being as skinny as a stick of seaside rock, whilst Billy is noted for having the foulest breath this side of a cancerous dog. They are described collectively as being the strangest double act in the criminal circus, and are noted for being hard bastards, but their main activities are hijacking lorries and their loads. Eddie began to move into the property business by the 1980s, much like David Hunt and several other gangsters have done, in an attempt to legitimise their earnings and occupation. The book's timeline finishes around 1990, however, this is not the end of the story. In 2014, Eddie Blundell published the book Top Drawer Villain and was interviewed on Essex Radio, as well as doing an interview with his brother on Bernard O'Mahony's British Gangsters, Faces of the Underworld. In the radio interview, he claims to have retired many years ago from crime and packed up his last business months prior to the interview.
You go legit, as they say. I mean, you've been legit for a long time, and now you look back on those days with regret or with relish or with interest or with a lesson to learn?
I mean, I learnt my lessons, obviously. I mean, you can't go through something like that and not learn the lesson. But when I did go to prison, I got 4 years. Obviously, I felt that I got 4 years for nothing because I didn't do to them anything they didn't do to somebody else. I mean, you look now all over the country, street traders argue and fight with each other.
What do you do now then, Eddie? What's your kind of thing here?
I'm retired now, I'm 73 years of age, and really I don't do a lot now. I was active till, say, 6 or 7 months ago, tell a lie, 18 months ago when we stopped our last business. But the thing with me is, you've got to understand, I've always been in some sort of business.
But this is simply not true. In 2016, Eddie Blundell was in court along with several others on charges of blackmail and fraud. Both brothers appear to have been involved in the car clamping business, which is poorly regulated and is often a front for organised crime. Blundell, then 75, was spared jail but was banned from being a company director and also had to obey a curfew. His address was listed as being on Berwick Pond Road, on the outskirts of Upminster, on the edge of the Greater London border. So we know he lied about his activities and his status as a businessman in 2014, which raises the question, what else was he lying about? In the book, there is little to no mention of drugs, yet drugs are the crux to most organised criminals. The book ended in 1990, 5 years before the infamous Essex boys murder. It appears that the Mullet brothers, mentioned in police reports, actually refers to the Blundells. If this is true, this would mean that it was the Blundells who lent Pat Tate and co. £40,000 for their weed deal that went wrong, and of course, that means they may well have been responsible in part, at the very least, for the murder of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. Billy Blundell died in August 2020, aged 77. The ice cream business they founded still exists. You may or may not have heard of the murder at a petrol station on the outskirts of Chelmsford in 2017, in which a man, John Pordage, was shot dead by a teenager, Bradley Blundell. That's right, Blundell. Another Blundell committing a firearms crime in the same area as the two brothers? Surely that could not be a coincidence. Well, there's no such thing, and whilst I have not had it corroborated, I have been told that Bradley Blundell is indeed a relative of the Blundells and is actually Billy Blundell's grandson. It appears that crime is a way of life for this family, passed down through generations. The status of Eddie Blundell is unknown, though he will now be around 82 years old. It is more than likely that he is still alive.